Okay, great. We're live. Okay. Great, and we're good. So thanks for everyone for joining us today. Laura is actually out on assignments, but I'm joined with my colleague here. I'm Jeremiah Cothran. I'm the communications director for the Laura Flanders Show.
And I'm Sabrina Artel, the story producer, and so happy to be in this conversation with Maximillian Alvarez. Jeremiah, you want to make an introduction for us?
Absolutely. So as everyone saw, Max is joining us, Maximillian Alvarez. He's the editor-in-chief of the Real News Network and also the host of the podcast Working People, which is produced in partnership with In These Times. It's a podcast by, for, and about the working class today.
Everybody, thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you so much, Maximillian. So I would like to talk with you about the cultural shift. So what is the cultural shift in labor consciousness that's happened over the last decades?
Yeah, so I mean, it's something that I kind of touched on in the segment that just premiered a half an hour ago, which I was really and truly honored to be a part of. And again, I just want to stress for everyone watching there how important the work that the Laura Flanders Show does is, and how much they should support it. And how exciting it is to be in this moment with the Laura Flanders Show, with Sarah Jaffe, with Kim Kelly, and all the great folks who are committing to covering what this cultural shift in the working populace is looking like. And I also would be remiss if I didn't smack myself on the head, because there was one area where I misspoke in the episode where I was trying to emphasize for people how much Jeff Bezos made in the last year, and I said 70 million. He made over 70 billion. Sorry, it was
so
way
that's
more than that.
70 billion in 1 month, right?
It's unfathomable. It's unfathomable to us as the size of the universe how much wealth Jeff Bezos has. So I'm sorry I misspoke about that, but okay. Anyway, so this cultural shift, as I kind of address near the end of the show, right? And it's something that I think requires us to zoom out a bit and try to kind of think about what the state of not only labor politics, but coverage of worker issues and worker struggles in the media over the course of our lifetimes, right? I admitted, on the show that I grew up in Orange County, California, the kind of heart of the Reagan Revolution, very conservative, very Catholic, which is not uncommon for Latinos or immigrants in general. There is, and I would caution people against kind of thinking in those kind of rigid terms. There are a lot of reasons why people become conservative, and I've talked about my own many times on my show and other shows. But the point being is that I also grew up in a time when the promise of upward mobility still seemed possible in this country, right? Many of us have been part of, or at least adjacent to, that generational shift where in the 90s, with the end of the Cold War, with the dot-com boom, right, with this kind of seeming dominance of the American liberal, democratic, and economic model, right, that this was going to be the main model that would be spread globally throughout the 21st century. And that with that came kind of a huge push for everyone to go to college and to then kind of take on the loans that you were going to need to, because there were going to be so many white collar and specialized jobs and yada 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 that would allow you to make a comfortable, dignified, middle class life. Right. I mean, that's really like the kind of crucible of the 90s in a nutshell for those of us who still had our futures ahead of us. And if you look at sort of the job numbers and which jobs were growing in that area, it kind of bears that out, right? It kind of seemed, at least for a lot of us, like this was a viable kind of option moving forward. Things really changed. I think that, the recession was really kind of the final breaking point of that promise. Right. And this is what I mean when I say it's important to kind of take the long view, right? Because there are a number of big events that happen on the way from there to hear. And I'm glossing over a lot of them. Like, obviously, when it comes to media, when it comes to surveillance, 9/11 had a really outsized impact on the kind of culture itself. Then you kind of had this sort of slow move towards, like, almost like you're in a river moving towards a waterfall. That's how the culture felt as we approached the Great Recession, right? Then the economy really kind of blew up, and that was, I think, like, it took a while for a lot of us to realize the devastation that had truly been wrought from the Great Recession, my own family included, right? I mean, I mentioned this on the show that my family ended up losing everything, including eventually the house that I grew up in. But that was a couple years later. It was a slow, drawn out, painful experience whereby we were always being told the recovery was coming or that it was happening, but it really wasn't translating to our daily lived realities. And I think that the farther away we got from the recession itself, or the crash, I should say, the more that millions of people realized that they were being completely left behind, that the gains that were being made after the recession were almost exclusively going to the top 1 or 2%, right? That all the bailouts, all the legal maneuverings that made it possible for big corporations and banks to recover were by no means trickling down to us, and providing the relief that so many working people in the United States, let alone around the world, desperately needed. And so with that, with the kind of decade that followed, the 2010 to now, basically, right, I think we have seen this really tremendous shift in the culture that has occurred in many different pockets. But the one that I really try to focus on in my work, and I think in many ways Kim and Sarah do a beautiful job of this as well, right, is we try to show how within the minds and lives of working people themselves, we started to see ourselves more as part of a working class that is being screwed over, right? More part of a class whose paths to upward mobility were being cut off, right? And that was something that didn't happen before the recession, not nearly as much. It's not as if worker struggles weren't happening before that. Of course they were, but there were a lot bigger cultural barriers to people feeling like they had the right to demand more in their workplace instead of just leaving and going finding work somewhere else. They had a need to connect their pain and struggle to those of their fellow workers around the country, right? We moved from this kind of atomization and individualization of struggles of workers before the recession to this painful process of people starting to see how they were part of a broader system that was oppressing and exploiting and underpaying a massive portion of the population in the decade after the recession. And that is a really important shift that has allowed us, allowed stories like Bessemer to resonate so much in the minds of people around the country and beyond.
Absolutely. And we talk about Bessemer, but also this coming week, I believe it's 19th of May, McDonald's in 15 cities, they're going to be striking across the country. What kind of labor struggles are you seeing on the ground now that you're really excited about, that talk about this growing movement and this growing power in the labor struggle?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad you brought that up because it speaks to two big things, right? One, that kind of cultural and psychological shift within kind of the working class itself, right? To see itself as more deserving of this attention and more emboldened to fight the fights that we need to fight. But also on the media side, there's a really kind of interesting component here. And I wanted to take that, the McDonald's strike that's coming up as an example, right? Because of course, McDonald's PR kind of wizard that it is tried to get ahead of this and say, oh, we're raising like $15, our wage to $15 an hour. Then it comes out, it's like, well, that's basically going to apply to like 5% of your stores.
Exactly.
It doesn't apply to franchises. So it's basically just like a purely symbolic PR move. And the people behind the Fight for 15, McDonald's workers all across the country, are really calling BS on this. And they're going to go to the mat to kind of show the rest of the country and the rest of the world, and McDonald's especially, that that's not good enough and we're not going away without a fight, which again is very, very exciting. But the part that I wanted to link that to, right, is if we're talking about culture and media, right, is there's something going on here and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, but it feels very different, and I don't think it should be discounted. And what I mean by that is that in the past year, let's take that as our example.
Yeah.
We have seen the culture industry and the kind of mainstream media apparatus and its kind of tendrils that connect it to the nonprofit, like industrial complex, the talking heads who come out of these think tanks in DC, the politicians who are, linked to lobbying groups and big donors who have a vested interest in the narratives that the mainstream media spins. Again, I'm painting with a broad brush here, but you guys know what I'm talking about. We have seen instances where this apparatus has really kicked into gear to create a sort of consensus manufacturing narrative that it wants to shove down our throats. And the one that we saw that's related to this McDonald's strike is before we even had like 40% of our total population fully vaccinated in the country. This breathless, ghoulish chorus, right, of politicians, business owners, talking heads from DC arose in unison to essentially berate the American working public back into economic subservience as it was just starting to creep out of the pandemic. We saw this all over the media. Everyone was saying no one wants to work anymore, right? All these kind of John Stossel-esque, Mike Rowe-esque, downward punching anti-worker talking points that were saying like, oh, the problem after a pandemic where a lot of the workforce that would take these jobs has died or has also just been so spooked out of, the sacrifices that they have to make just to make a living at these underpaid jobs that provide so few protections during a deadly pandemic. A lot of people don't want to work there anymore, and they don't want to work there for that little anymore. Of course, people want to work. Like, someone tweeted about this, like, oh, if the starting salary for McDonald's was like $35,000 a year, you'd probably have a lot more people working there. And even 35,000 is really low, but it's like, so it's not really the money, right? It's or it's not really the I don't want to work. It's the money, it's the protections. Anyway, the point that I'm getting to is we saw what we've seen so many times before, right? At a time when the economy and the business owners and private interests that really need to build up their profits, right? They needed working people to feel bad about themselves and to get off unemployment and go back into the meat grinder and shut up and basically do their work. But we saw this bottom-up push against that narrative. Online, workers were posting, they were leaving their jobs, they were posting about it. You saw this kind of like rebellion against the fabricated mainstream media narrative. That is really, really interesting. You're also seeing that in other areas. We saw it in the past year with police videos and police narratives about killings of Black and brown people. We're seeing it now with the kind of international propaganda arm that is trying to tell us that we should not care for the plight of murdered Palestinians. There is a bottom-up push against these media narratives, and the labor movement is involved in that. And that's, I think, really exciting.
Thank you so much, Maximillian, for sharing this. It's such a good discussion. I just wanted to ask a question from one of our viewers. So let me go to that right now. So the question is, can the U.S. end the tip wage and pay servers a living wage as other countries have?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, like, absolutely we can. But I mean, I deeply sympathize with the person who asked this question, right? Because this is what I mean when I say about a cultural shift. Because before the recession, it was a basically a fact of nature that those minimum wage jobs were paid fairly, right? And we all took it. I regurgitated these talking points myself as a young worker, right? A young conservative worker. I was like, this is not a job that is meant to be a career, right? This is a stepping stone. This is just me getting some job training, yada, 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 right? And so the very thought that like people in these low wage jobs, these quote unquote low skilled jobs, deserved as little as they got, that was more or less a taken for granted point in the pre-recession kind of zeitgeist. Now, not so much. Now we are at least emboldened enough to say, does it have to be this way? Why is it this way? And could it be better? Right? Those are the questions that are really, kind of manifesting themselves in workers, whether they're in the service sector, whether they're in places like Amazon, whether they aren't even currently categorized as workers right now, right? I mean, people are growing a sort of sense of how much their labor makes society run, right? This is what we ended the segment that aired today talking about. The
Yeah.
pandemic showed us whose labor kept society from falling apart, right? It was the care work that people did at home to take care of their loved ones, their babies, their elderly family members, right? It was deliveries made by gig workers and postal
Yeah.
workers. It was people like in essential industries who were risking their lives to kind of keep the gears of commerce churning. And I think that you can't unsee that, right? That's the thing that we're seeing is people
That's a great
saw.
point,
Yeah,
right? About not being able to unsee it now that it's happened. And there's a redefining, isn't there, that's going on in this cultural shift around labor and work that you're
I think so.
A
I
hundred
think so.
percent, and also talking about recategorization of work, and who is an employee. And I know there's a big push from companies like Uber and Lyft and Instacart who are putting in millions of dollars to push against this reclassification. Can you talk a little bit about those dangers and really what's going on in this moment that we should know? Of course, Amazon is a huge entity that we should fight against, but there's also this they call them the Worker App Alliance, I believe.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I'll start with like an example that people probably heard about in the past couple weeks, right? Because there was in that sort of chorus that I was just talking about the whole "no one wants to work anymore," thing, right? This narrative that was beaten over that we were having beaten over our heads and shoved down our throats. In that there was a story or an article written, it's escaping me where it was written. It might have been like the Wall Street Journal or something,
Mhm.
but it was of kind of a CEO saying that employees were still scared to go back into the office, right? Because they were worried about COVID variants. They were worried about still being able to pass on the virus to family members at home who were not vaccinated, so on and so forth. And here comes kind of the CEO saying the quiet part out loud, which was, if people don't go back to the office, then what's going to happen is bosses are going to realize that maybe we actually don't need that many people in the office. So what we should be doing, instead of having this kind of set workforce in our office space, we're going to have just a skeleton crew, and everything else is going to be contracted out through a sort of gig model, through a sort of TaskRabbit model, where we can kind of basically get workers who are desperate for jobs to bid against one another and say that they'll do X job for the lowest pay possible, and then they'll get no benefits, they'll get no continued wages, they won't be a full classified worker, but for the business side, the job that they need to get done will get done, and then they can wash their hands of it. This is where things are going right now, and no one knows this better than Silicon Valley, which is why they are trying so hard to dig deep into the legal, political, and cultural infrastructure that we have right now to essentially set the terrain moving forward. When more and more of us realize that we are falling into this trap of gig work, or piecework, as Vina Dubal, a brilliant scholar, calls it, right? Because you're just piecing together a
Yeah.
living through these little tasks, right, that are getting paid minimum from all these different places, and you're a supposed independent contractor, right? So this piecework economy that more and more of us are heading towards, the gig companies and politicians kind of know that they're going to be the more people who are in that, the more people are going to realize that actually they can't make a living that way. They're making less than minimum wage. They're working more than 8 hours a day. And then they're going to say, well, wait, we should demand better. And then they're going to turn
Yeah.
around and realize through things like Prop 22 in California that they do not have the legal standing to do anything about it. And that power has been taken away in the dead of night by the very companies that are employing them. And so I think, that's where the message that Sarah and Kim emphasized in the episode today really, really becomes important, where they both said, like, you don't need a National Labor Relations Board approved vote to become a union. If you have workers
Yeah.
banding together, acting in their own collective interest as a union, then they're a union, right? Then they have the ability. And we saw this with gig companies during the pandemic. I would point to the Gig Workers Collective and people like Vanessa Bain, an Instacart shopper, or Willie Solis, who's a ship shopper and organizer in Texas. Vanessa and her fellow Instacart shoppers went on a walkout like this time last year to demand PPE, right? They're not a union, right? They don't have the legal standing to do this, but they acted together to withhold their labor, to raise their voices and demand that they get what they deserve as workers. And so I think that that's what it's going to take moving forward.
Yes. Oh, thank you, Maximilian. So we have a couple of questions. So from our viewers here, our audience, thank you so much for your questions and for joining us. So I'm going to combine one, and then there's another one as well. So the question is, how come capitalists are only in favor of, quote, markets when it comes to pricing their products? However, when there's a shortage of labor, they don't want to increase the wages they offer. And then the same person follows that up with using an example in Western Europe. The minimum wage is $22 an hour. That includes universal health care, 4 weeks vacation, 1 year parental leave, et cetera, et cetera. A Big Mac is still the same price in Europe as it is here in the United States.
So I'm smiling, not because, because it's a great question, but I'm
Yeah.
thinking about, what was the remake with Will Smith of the robot movie where all the robots are kind of taking over? Not I Am Legend, but
I know the one you mean, but I cannot remember.
Right. So the
name,
reason I'm
yeah.
thinking about it, right, is that he's trying to solve this murder and he can only talk to a hologram of the person who was murdered. And he's trying to get an answer from him. And the guy just keeps saying that's not the right question. And finally, the kind of guy who says, like, that is the right question. I think that the question that we're asking here is finally the right question, right? Because and people are starting to ask it, right? I've seen more and more people, especially online, but also people who listen to my show, who watch The Real News, saying, you're like, man, we're always kind of scared with the threat that, like, if workers get, and $15, like, we already know this, but it bears repeating, $15 an hour is not a living wage right now, right? This was like supposed to be the demand that would have been a living wage years ago.
Okay, wait, let me insert something because the next question is about living wage. Mm-hmm. So just to combine it, so it's our audience members asking, the term is confusing for him because if you're a business owner, how do you calculate it for your own business and your own workers? Is it the same nationwide, or how does one enact that?
Yeah, I mean, like, this is something that I think is a valid, like, point. And, like, as someone who has an economist brother, it's a point that I'm often told to kind of answer about, right? That, like, the cost of living is different in different parts of the country, right? $15 is going to mean a lot less in New York City than it's going to mean, somewhere else in the world, right? Or somewhere else in the country, right? So of course, you have to kind of take into account those sorts of things. However, there is, and needs to be kind of a national baseline, right? A kind of minimum standard by which people are able to live their lives without working 2 jobs and not being able to see their families, without only being able to go to work, pay bills, go to sleep, and go back, right? I mean, there has to be more than that. That has to be the criteria by which we are talking about what should a job pay in order to allow people to sort of live the lives that they deserve, especially in a country that has more than enough wealth to make it happen. This is the point I was about to make, is that I'm excited that people are seeing the question, or are asking the question, because we're always told that if we raise the minimum wage, from the minimum wage, the national minimum wage right now, and the time that it has taken to raise it is just
Yeah.
absurd, right? I mean, so just whoever's watching, start there. We are starting with like an incredibly low minimum wage that has not risen in the longest period of time, I think, in American history, while the profits and pay going to CEOs in the top 1% have skyrocketed like to levels unseen in this country before. The money is there and the workers are the ones who are generating that money. It's just all being siphoned off, right? And then for, you know, small business owners who are not kind of like necessarily in that category, you should be in the same fight as we are. You should say, hey, all the money that would allow me to pay my workers what they deserve is going up there, right? I mean, like, so we should be making those people pay their fair share, which it's hard to even conceive what that fair share is when you take into account all that has been stolen, all that has been stashed off seas, yada yada yada. I'm going on a long rant, but the point that I was trying to make is that people are saying, instead of the narrative that the corporate class narrative that we always hear, which is if we raise the wages, it's going to raise the prices of you know, a Big Mac, right? And then that's going to be pushed onto the consumer. I'm starting to see people say, it's like, well, how come no one says the fact that like the McDonald's CEO is raking in like $300+ million a year or something like that? How come that doesn't raise the price of a Big Mac, right? I mean, why is it the workers, you know, who are scraping by on like, you know, barely $8 an hour? Why are they the enemy right here? And that's really what I hope people take away from this conversation, from the segment that aired today, is that for the longest time, the media that serves, you know, largely serves the interests of kind of this class, the business class, and that does so by berating workers into believing that they should not ask for more, that they don't deserve more, and that they just don't get how the economy works, so they should shut up and be grateful, right? That sort of apparatus, right, is that's why it's designed to do what it does, right? It's not objective truth. It can be challenged and it should be challenged, and we should all join that fight to challenge it and ask kind of what the system itself could be instead of what we have right now.
Especially when McDonald's just reported that, you know, they made $5 billion in profits last year during the pandemic, right? So we can't forget that. We have, you know, this is such an amazing conversation, and but I want to ask you just a few more questions to talk about some of your upcoming reporting. I know you just had a very special report, which I encourage everyone to listen to, about the worker struggle in Myanmar, and talking about international solidarity there. What kind of reporting should we be looking for? And I want to give you a chance also to talk a little bit about this upcoming book that should be coming out when?
Coming out hopefully later this summer, and thank you. I really do appreciate it. So I guess I'll work backwards. So for the past year, I've been working on this book with OR Books, which is a great independent publisher. They basically asked me to put together a collection of interviews with workers during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Kind of doing what I do on my show, kind of embodying what we've been talking about here, right? What I think I try to do differently with the way that I approach talking to working people in the US and abroad is I really try to focus on them as human beings, right? I try to show that we are not just name tags and job titles, right? We are flesh and blood human beings with complex lives and histories and desires and wants that bind us to one another in kind of complex ways. And there's a point to that, right? Because if we are going to build the kind of solidarity that we need to create the kind of bottom-up movement that it's going to take to change this society and to change this economy and make it work for all of us, then we have to train ourselves to see one another as human beings again, not just services that we bought and paid for, not just name tags that are delivering something to us, but as other human beings who deserve to live better than this, just like we do, right? And so that's what I really try to do in my work, especially through the podcast Working People, right? Is really humanize, you know, the stories, you know, of workers who are making this world run and make it happen. That's also what I'm trying to do in this book, right? It's not a book about COVID. It's a book about human beings who are working during the COVID-19 pandemic and talking about like how they have experienced it, how it shaped their work, but also how it shaped, you know, their lives over the past year. So that's coming up. The podcast itself is continuing, and I really appreciate Jeremiah the shout out about the recent episode with worker organizers that I interviewed in Myanmar, because I think that this is really important for all of us, right? Is that we have a long way to go to build that worker solidarity in the US. Then the next step is like we have to build solidarity with workers here internationally, right? Because that is the only way that we're going to be able to take on the kind of hegemonic system and powers that we're talking about, right? Kim and Sarah talked about this in the segment. Look at Amazon as an example. Amazon is not playing on national rules. Amazon's an international behemoth. So if we're trying to fight it on local grounds without connecting our struggles to Amazon workers around the world, we're going to lose. So we need to, it's a strategic necessity, not just a moral imperative. It's both, right? To build that solidarity with workers internationally. And that's something that I hope the Real News Network and my show Working People and all the kind of great work that labor media folks, not just Sarah and Kim, but so many others who I want to name but can't, but like there are a lot out there. Please take advantage of their work. Please support their work. And right now in Working People, I'm actually in that vein. I recorded an episode, a conversation with someone on the ground in Colombia earlier this week, who is giving a firsthand account of the kind of strike that's going on there, the popular protests against the neoliberal government and the police crackdown on protesters. And I am right now trying to finish kind of organizing an interview that will be paired with that with someone on the ground in Palestine, right? And what I'm essentially trying to do for the primarily North American based audience of workers, you know, who listen to this show is I'm trying to not only educate them and show them what is happening, given that the mainstream media rarely ever give us that education, but also, as we so often do on the show, trying to let the reasons for why we should have solidarity with the people of Palestine, with the people of Colombia, with working people around the world, to let those shine through, and for people here in the United States to realize, like, wow, we have a lot more in common with them than we do with the billionaires who dominate our society. Maybe that's the path to our salvation, right? Is building that sort of international solidarity. And I'm genuinely proud of all the work that we are doing at the Real News to highlight that, right? Jessel Noor, our great reporter, just launched like this incredible series that's grant funded by the Solutions Journalism Network that he's been working on for months on how worker co-ops have survived the pandemic. And he looks at worker cooperatives across like 4 different states, talks to the workers there, and they show how their economic model made them more able to prioritize the safety of their workers and to become more economically viable in pandemic conditions, right? The Mark Steiner show, the Eddie Conway show, Rattling the Bars, the local coverage that we're doing here in Baltimore with Lisa Snow McCrae and Brandon Soderberg, the Police Accountability Report with Stephen Janis and Taya Graham. It's all a piece, right, of this kind of larger push to empower working people through media, to empower all who see it, right, to realize that things could be different, right? The injustices that we see, they are connected by kind of similar political and economic forces that also oppress us in the workplace, that also, you know, like kind of take advantage of us in so many other realms. And so it's important for us to see how these things are connected, to learn about them, because the mainstream media won't give us the education that we need, and then to use that media as a way that, as something that empowers us to act democratically in the world that we're a part of.
Maximillian, thank you. Something that empowers us to act democratically in the world. I mean, that's an incredible way to close this conversation. Really extraordinary. Please watch the episode if you missed it, lauraflanders.org or the Laura Flanders Show YouTube channel. There'll be information about Maximillian Alvarez there as well. Jeremiah, why don't you close us out?
Yeah, that's wonderful, Max. Thank you so much for for your insight. And I encourage everyone also to talk about to visit therealnews.com to find out more of the reporting. And for everyone, we're joined with Maximillian Alvarez. He's the editor-in-chief of the Real News Network and the host of the Working People podcast. Thank you, everyone, so much for tuning in.
Yes, thank you, Max.
Thank you, Max, so much.
Thank you. All right. Goodbye.
All right, bye.